Peter Falk, always the clever detective in the rumpled coat, always the man with the knowing smile, was shattered by a loss the world barely saw coming. When John Cassavetes, his closest friend and creative partner, died, Falk was never the same. To fans, he carried on as Columbo, the unshakable investigator. But behind the scenes, something broke, and he never spoke openly about it. For decades, this quiet pain stayed hidden, sealed away with the memories of their time together. Until now, to the outside world, Peter Falk was always Columbo, the trench coat, the glass eye, the one more question. But long before the world knew him as the television detective who always knew more than he let on, Falk had already forged the most important relationship of his life. A creative, spiritual, and deeply personal bond with fellow actor and filmmaker John Cassavetes. They met in the 1960s, when both men were still carving out their identities in Hollywood. Falk, still several years away from Columbo, had been working steadily but quietly. Cassavetes, meanwhile, had already begun to develop a reputation as a maverick, a fiercely independent writer-director with no patience for the gloss of Hollywood. What drew them together wasn't ambition or opportunity. It was something rarer. They understood each other. Falk would later say that Cassavetes was the one person who saw who he really was, underneath the nervous charm and dry wit. And Cassavetes admired something in Falk too, his vulnerability. He saw an actor who could be both gentle and wild, subtle and explosive, funny and tragic. Together, they weren't just friends, they became soul-level collaborators. Their first major project together was Husbands in 1970, a raw, unscripted film about grief, masculinity, and the quiet desperation that haunts middle-aged men. Falk starred in it alongside Cassavetes and Ben Gazzara, and the three of them weren't just acting. They were exorcising something, channeling loss, confusion, and longing in a way that felt almost too real. There were no glossy monologues or tightly controlled performances. They stumbled, they argued, they broke down. And Falk, in the middle of it all, found something that he'd later say changed him forever. Cassavetes didn't direct like anyone else. He didn't demand perfection, he demanded truth. And Falk, who had spent years trying to conform to Hollywood expectations, found in Cassavetes someone who gave him permission to be raw, real, messy. He often said that working with Cassavetes taught him how to be brave on screen. And off, the collaboration didn't end with Husbands. They would reunite for several more projects over the years, including A Woman Under the Influence and Mikey and Nikki. And every time something unspoken happened between them, their trust in each other created a space where Falk could risk everything as a performer and know that Cassavetes would catch him if he fell. But it went far deeper than the work. They shared dinners, phone calls, long nights filled with arguments and laughter. Their families were close. When one of them hurt, the other showed up. When Cassavetes struggled with his health, it was Falk who kept checking in, never letting go, even when things looked bleak. Yet Falk never truly prepared himself for the day Cassavetes would be gone. In 1989, when John Cassavetes died from cirrhosis of the liver, Peter Falk withdrew. The man who always had a comeback, who always had one more thing to say, fell silent. And though he continued to act, Columbo continued, awards kept coming. Something in him had shifted, something had closed. He would rarely speak about Cassavetes in public after that. When he did, his voice would catch. His hands would fidget. He'd change the subject. To fans, it looked like a man moving on. But to those who knew him, it was clear. Peter Falk had lost more than a friend. He had lost the one person who had given him the freedom to be fully himself. And in the years that followed, what he never said about that loss would quietly shape everything that came next. To understand what John Cassavetes truly meant to Peter Falk, you have to look beyond the films. Beyond the scripts, the cameras, even the audiences. What they had was something deeper. Something that most actors, most people, never find in an entire lifetime. For Falk, Cassavetes wasn't just a director. He was the first person in the industry who looked at him and said, "Don't act." Sounds simple. But for Falk, who had spent years learning the craft, building a career on precise choices and carefully delivered lines, it was revolutionary. Cassavetes didn't want performance. He wanted truth. and Peter Falk, beneath the wit and character quirks, was full of it. In Cassavetes' world, the camera didn't stop rolling when the scene got uncomfortable. In fact, that's when it started to matter. Falk wasn't used to that. He came from a world of clean takes and controlled emotion. But with Cassavetes, he was thrown into chaos. Scenes where the dialogue changed by the minute, where he had to feel his way through, not think his way through. And at first, it rattled him. But then something shifted. Cassavetes trusted Falk with roles that showed his soul. Not the charming detective, not the clever supporting man, but a husband in crisis, a friend unraveling, a man confronting the ache of being alive. And Falk, for all his insecurities, rose to meet that challenge every time. In those moments, Cassavetes wasn't just directing Peter Falk. He was transforming him, and Falk never forgot it. He once said that Cassavetes showed him how to be fearless, not just on screen but in life, how to embrace the mess of human emotion without apology, how to let silence speak louder than words, how to trust that if you open up fully, if you let yourself really be seen, it won't break you. It will free you. It was Cassavetes who pushed Falk into his most vulnerable work, and in doing so, gave him a kind of creative immortality. The performances they created together weren't just good, they were alive, raw, unpolished, human, and Peter Falk knew it. He was fiercely loyal to Cassavetes, not just as a friend, but as a guide. Even when they disagreed, even when filming got tense, even when Cassavetes' methods bordered on chaos, Falk never walked away. He respected that Cassavetes was doing something no one else dared to do, telling the truth about people, about love, about grief, about life at its most unfiltered. And it wasn't just professional admiration. There was a spiritual bond there. Cassavetes believed in Peter Falk in a way that few ever had. He didn't just see him as a TV actor or a character face. He saw the artist inside, the man who longed to be taken seriously, who wanted to reach deeper, who was afraid no one would ever really understand him. Cassavetes understood. So when John died in 1989, something in Peter Falk fractured. Yes, he kept acting. He even revived Columbo. But those who watched closely saw the difference. The performances were sharp, yes. The charm was still there. But the spark, the wild, soulful energy that had poured out of him in those Cassavetes films was dimmer, tucked away, maybe even buried. Because it wasn't just that Peter Falk had lost a collaborator. He had lost the one man who had seen the deepest parts of him and handed them back without judgment. And as Falk grew older and the industry changed and the roles became fewer, he never found that kind of connection again. He didn't want to, because some people come into your life only once. And when they leave, they take a piece of you with them. Peter Falk was not a man who wore his grief on his sleeve. He joked, he charmed, he deflected, but he rarely, if ever, allowed the public to see the weight he carried after John Cassavetes died. And that silence was not because he didn't feel it. It was because the loss was too personal, too raw. And for a man who had spent a lifetime delivering lines, inhabiting characters, and making audiences laugh with his offbeat charm, Peter Falk didn't quite know how to speak as himself. Not about this. The truth is, Falk and Cassavetes were more than just friends. They were each other's creative lifelines. To lose Cassavetes wasn't just to lose a person. It was to lose the only mirror Falk ever truly trusted. So instead of grand public tributes or long interviews, Falk mourned in the way many deeply sensitive people do. Quietly, internally, in small gestures that most fans would never notice. A brief mention of John in a conversation. A shift in expression when asked about their films. A change in energy when the topic lingered too long. Behind the scenes, those closest to Falk could tell that something had shifted in him. He still worked, he was a consummate professional, but the joy had dulled. His eyes, once so sharp and full of fire, carried more weight, more pause, as if something inside him had been muted. Friends recall that after Cassavetes' funeral, Falk withdrew. He stopped attending certain industry events. He said no to projects he might have once considered. He returned to Columbo, yes, but even that role, the one the world knew him for, seemed more like a shell than a sanctuary. And when he did speak of Cassavetes, it was never about the loss. It was always about the life. He would mention John's laugh, his stubbornness, the way he tore scripts apart and rebuilt them from instinct. He would smile and recall how they'd argue for hours, then hug like brothers 5 minutes later. He'd talk about how Cassavetes could drive him crazy on set, but always knew what scene to keep, what take to trust. But when it came to the end, when it came to John's illness and decline and death, Falk said very little. It wasn't because he didn't want to talk about it. It was because talking about it might make it real. You see, Cassavetes had always seemed larger than life to Falk. He was the one who couldn't die, the one who had too much fire in him to simply disappear. So when the call came, when the reality set in, Falk wasn't just mourning his best friend. He was confronting a world without the one person who had anchored him emotionally and artistically. In the years that followed, Falk kept that grief close, tucked inside. Only once or twice did he hint at it, offhand comments in small interviews. A mention that John would have loved this, a quiet nod to their films. But he never sat down and spoke about it directly. And maybe that's why it still hurts fans today. Because we all thought we knew Peter Falk. We all thought we understood what Columbo meant to him. But the truth is, behind the man in the trench coat was someone who had once been set free, creatively, emotionally, spiritually, by John Cassavetes. And when John died, the door that had once opened so wide quietly closed again. He didn't need to say it out loud. His silence said everything. There's something poetic about the way Peter Falk chose to honor John Cassavetes. He didn't do it with speeches, or award season tributes, or long public memories published in magazines. Instead, he honored him in the quietest, most intimate way possible, by holding on to the things only they shared. One of those things was a small handwritten note, kept in a drawer in Falk's Los Angeles home. It wasn't discovered until after Falk's passing in 2011. And even then, only those closest to him knew what it meant. The note had been written by Cassavetes sometime in the mid-1970s, likely during the making of Mikey and Nicky, or possibly Husbands. It was brief, almost cryptic. It reads simply, "You don't have to act, you just have to feel, and I'll take care of the rest." Falk kept that note for decades. He never framed it, never talked about it. He just kept it nearby, even as his memory began to fade in his later years. Those words meant everything to him. They were a reminder of the one person who truly saw him, not as a performer, not as a personality, but as a man. And that wasn't the only quiet tribute. Falk's estate included a hidden storage box, tucked in the back of a closet, almost forgotten. Inside were rolls of film, some old scripts, and 2 photographs. One of Peter and John on the set of Husbands, mid-laugh and disheveled as always, and another taken at a family barbecue in the late 70s. Both men had their arms around each other, beer bottles in hand, grinning like kids. Falk had never shown those photos to the press. He never used them in retrospectives. They weren't there for public consumption. They were his memory, his way of holding on. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part? Falk never watched Husbands again after Cassavetes died. He had once said the film was too raw to revisit, too personal. But after John's death, it became more than that. It became a wound, a snapshot of a time when the two of them were invincible, fearless, and full of artistic fire. Watching it meant confronting the loss. So he couldn't. And then, in his final years, when Alzheimer's began to take hold and memory started to slip, Falk's wife, Shara Danese, noticed something striking. On good days, when he seemed more present, more himself, he would ask about John. He would mention a line from a film they did, or laugh quietly to himself as if remembering a joke only the two of them had shared. Even as so much else faded, Cassavetes never did. That kind of bond doesn't dissolve. It doesn't disappear. It lingers. It lives in the parts of us untouched by time or even illness. And when Peter Falk passed away in 2011, those close to him knew. He hadn't just left behind a legendary career or a beloved character. He had left behind a legacy of love. One built in late-night conversations, unscripted takes, and emotional risks shared with one man who always believed in him. A man whose loss he never recovered from. And yet, Falk never needed the world to know any of this, because in his heart, he had already said goodbye the only way he knew how, by holding it all close and never letting it go. For years, fans of Peter Falk saw only part of the picture. They knew him as Columbo, the detective who always knew what others missed. They admired his sharp wit, his oddball charm, the way he could command a scene with a single glance. They knew the roles, they knew the voice, but what they didn't know, what many are only now beginning to understand, is how much of that quiet depth came from someone else entirely. From John Cassavetes. It wasn't until recently, more than a decade after Falk's passing, that pieces of the story began surfacing. Interviews that had been buried, recollections from those close to the two men, and private archives that fans had never seen. And what they reveal is something far deeper than most ever imagined. In a 1981 interview never aired but preserved on cassette tape, a former assistant editor for Mikey and Nicky recalled a conversation between Falk and Cassavetes during a late-night shoot. Cassavetes had pulled Falk aside after a scene and said something almost prophetic. "Someday they'll only remember you as Columbo, but I'll remember this version of you, the one you hide." That line, spoken quietly, off-camera, in the heat of an emotional production, stayed with Falk. According to the editor, Falk sat in silence for a full minute before simply replying, "That's the one I wish I could show more." Fans who've listened to the recovered tape say it recontextualizes everything. That the warmth Falk brought to Columbo, the sadness behind his eyes, the subtle pain in his later performances, it all came from a deep emotional well. A well Cassavetes helped him uncover. And now that fans are hearing these private reflections, now that these long-hidden pieces are coming to light, something remarkable is happening. They're seeing Peter Falk the man, not just the character. They're revisiting husbands, a woman under the influence, and Mikey and Nicky with new eyes. They're seeing how deeply Cassavetes shaped him, not just as an actor, but as a human being. And they're realizing that behind the public persona of Columbo was a man who never fully healed from the loss of his closest friend. On forums and tribute pages, fans are writing messages like, "I always loved Peter Falk, but I didn't know how much he was hurting." They were more than collaborators. They were soulmates in a way. Now I understand why he looked so sad in those later Columbo episodes. It wasn't just acting, it was grief. This wave of rediscovery has also sparked renewed interest in the Columbo episodes where Falk seemed more introspective, more pained, particularly those filmed after 1989. Fans are now combing through scenes, finding subtle moments. The sighs, the silences, the heaviness in his delivery, and asking themselves, was that Peter Falk? Or was that the version of himself Cassavetes once told him to stop hiding? What makes all of this hit even harder now is the context of Falk's own final years. The Alzheimer's, the silence, the fact that, as his memories slipped away, the people who knew him best say he still remembered John. That kind of love, creative, emotional, unspoken, doesn't fade. It becomes part of a person. And now, with fans finally piecing it all together, Peter Falk's legacy feels fuller, more complete. Not just a brilliant actor, not just the man in the trench coat, but a man who once had someone who understood him completely and never quite got over losing him. To the world, Peter Falk was always one step ahead, always asking just one more question, always making us smile. But behind the scenes, there was a deeper story, quieter one. A love between friends that ran deeper than fame or success or even legacy. John Cassavetes wasn't just a collaborator. He was the only person who truly saw Peter Falk, understood his doubts, his brilliance, his vulnerabilities, and gave him the space to become something more than anyone expected. Together, they created moments on screen that were messy, beautiful, and real because they trusted each other with the truth. And when John died, Peter carried that silence for the rest of his life. No press release could explain it. No tribute could capture it, because what they had wasn't meant for the public. It was meant for the spaces in between, the pauses, the looks, the unsaid words. Now, years later, fans are finally seeing that picture more clearly. Not just Columbo, not just the performances, but the man who lost a piece of himself the day John Cassavetes left this world. and maybe in understanding that we understand Peter Falk just a little better too. For more emotional stories, check out this video.